right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're located in the world. We have a couple of housekeeping first to go through, and then we'll officially begin. So we have an opening question. If you could please respond as we go through our housekeeping items and introduce our panelists. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and except for the speakers, we'd like everyone to mute themselves. And during the presentation, if you have a question, you can enter it at any time in the chat box and clicking the send button, and we'll get to it closer to the end of the webinar. We will have some Q&A time, as I mentioned, so we'll try to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A, but there also may be a moment where if something is super relevant to the conversation, I may interject and read aloud a question. So let me introduce myself. I am Jasmine Hall-Ratliff, Deputy Director at Keisha Harrison Associates. Thank you again for joining us. Welcome to the second InDEEP Closing the Gap webinar in a 4-part series. We're delighted that you've joined us, and we hope that what you learned today will aid you in advancing toward a more equitable funding environment for climate and conservation organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color in communities most impacted by the environmental crisis. This webinar will feature equity-centered regranting intermediaries in a moderated discussion on the knowledge, skills, and resources required to successfully serve and support BIPOC-led climate organizations with an equity-focused approach. So let me pause and see what folks are responding to in the chat box, if anyone has noted their intentions for today. So I'll move into introducing our speakers. It is my pleasure to have the 3 panelists join us today. We'll have more extensive bios on the InDEEP website with the recording of the webinar, but to briefly introduce folks, Sakita Grant is an environmental policy and social justice strategist and vice president of programs at the Solutions Project. She is also an environmental justice lecturer at Sacramento State University and has been a consultant supporting change makers in equitable climate policy and narrative. Roger Kim is executive director of the Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund and the Climate Equity Action Fund. He also serves as senior advisor at the Democracy Alliance, where he leads the organization's strategy to build political power for climate action. And then finally, Michael Johnson is director of advancement of the NBN Collective, a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and a relative of the White Earth Nation, where his grandfather is a citizen. Michael's work over the past decade has engaged key stakeholders in Indian country and beyond to create lasting relationships built on respect, reciprocity, impact, and success. Thank you, Sakita, Roger, and Michael for joining us. It'll be a pleasure to speak with you today. So our goal for this webinar is to share approaches and strategies from equity-centered regranting intermediaries in a moderated discussion of the skills, resources, and business models required to successfully serve and support climate organizations with an equity-focused approach. With that in mind, I'd like to invite our participants to respond to the following poll question. Of the 4 action steps that funders can take to create racially equitable funding flows, which ones are you seeing represented most successfully? So you have 4 options here. If you could take a moment to click the 1 or 2 that are most relevant to you, whether it's taking responsibility for building a pipeline, starting with your own bias or personal ecologies, interrogating the white supremacy culture norm that bigger is better, or following the lead of grantees of color. I'm seeing the lines start to change and zoom around, so we'll give folks a few seconds to respond. Okay. Let's go ahead and show the results. Thanks, Tahani. So it looks as though of those of you who responded, the majority are following the lead of grantees of color, with a close second of starting with your own personal bias and ecology. So, and then lastly, taking responsibility. So thank you to all those who responded. That helps our speakers get a sense of who's in the room and where you all are in your organizational journey. So let's go to the speakers. So the first question is for each of you. What does equity-centered design and strategy for grant making look like? And how is it different from traditional grant making? And Sakita, I'll start with you, and then Roger and Michael can follow up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jasmine. Thank you to Keisha Harris and Associates and everyone involved putting this on. I'm so excited. And if you don't know Michael and Roger yet, you will know. So that's part of my excitement too, is just to be rocking with these two and with Jasmine through these questions. So I love this question, and I'll put out a few things that come to mind. Many things came to mind, but I'll just give a few things, and then perhaps some of my co-panelists would like to add in. So I think, equity-centered design and strategy for grant making really requires, I think, deep and honest understanding. And I mean that to say we really have to understand why we are here, how we got here into this position where there is this balance of power around philanthropy and funding issues of inequities and why those inequities exist in the first place. And it requires a little bit of work, and some of us are somewhere along the spectrum of learning that, but I think it's really important to understand that. It's also important to understand what is on the line with this work, which most of us are pretty in tune with. What do we have to lose or gain? And also understanding what solutions have worked and what solutions that have been proposed as solutions have actually been false solutions and have not worked. And a lot of this requires, I think, connecting deeply with frontline communities and being really aligned with frontline movement to be able to have that understanding, because these are the folks who carry that knowledge. And that leads me to, once you have that understanding, I believe you will be able to lean into a reparations framework. Because once you understand why we're here, you understand that there's certain folks in certain industries that have created harm, and that there's a requirement that that harm be remedied and be repaired. And so I really appreciate that that word and that framing is coming up more, I think, in this context, but I think it's really important because it really requires us to understand responsibility and contributions, even if it's from ourselves. And sometimes, for grant making philanthropy, there is a very personal and organizational journey to understand how, what our contributions may have been, and to face that, which requires courage. And many of us are doing that right now. And really gets us to understanding the very, not so good origins of wealth creation in the first place, right? That requires stealing land, that requires oppressing people and enslaving people. So that, I think, that reparations framework is kind of the understanding and reparations framework is some fundamental pieces that I see are often missing, but I think can really free us, can liberate us to be able to have a more healthy relationship with each other and with money that most times is not our money, right? Like, have a healthier relationship. And then, of course, I think this will come up quite a bit, but and many of us are already embodying this, but really leaning to trust-based philanthropy, leaning into a relationship with grantee partners that really requires a lot of love, a lot of deep connection, and full valuation of the voices and solutions and experiences that our grantee partners are having. None of us have all the answers, or we wouldn't be here right now. And having an approach that I think is more egalitarian in the way that we work on these issues instead of a little bit less hierarchical, I think we can really move forward. And how is this different from traditional grant making? I think all of the things I flagged are not found in traditional grant making, at least that I know. So those are some of the things I wanted to start with.
Thanks, Sakita. Roger, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Jasmine and InDEEP, and just yeah, really excited to be here with everybody. And I would double down on everything Sakita said. You know, kind of the basis of all of this really is, as Sakita mentioned, you know, understanding the history and the processes of racial injustice and inequality, how we got to the state of the nation that we are in today. You know, why it is that people of color are more likely to die because of all those disparities. And a lot of those disparities have to do with how we have funded around environment and climate in particular. And that equity-centered grant making really starts from a place that understands that this status quo is not okay, and that philanthropic practices have been and are still complicit in this status quo. So double down on all that. Also, as Sakita mentioned, like the deep necessary part of it is the partnership piece with grantees and with communities, the deep listening, the sort of the understanding what organizations need, what they're trying to do, the kind of support that they need, so that it is a relationship not based on sort of just transaction, but on how are we going to create change and transformation together. And so I think that theme of like, you know, moving beyond the transactional relationship to a much more transformational relationship is key to it. And then finally, I'd add just, you know, just that this is necessary. Equity-centered design is necessary if we're going to win and create the kind of change that we need. And that's different than starting from a place of like equity-centered stuff is something that's good to do, or that is morally the right thing to do, which it all is. To also understand that it's a necessary thing that we need to do if we're going to create the change that we have to have.
Thanks, Roger. Michael, how about you? How are you going to follow up on all this?
Well, by first, Jasmine, and thanking you and the Keisha Harris Associates for hosting this and for the InDEEP initiative and series here. Dosha, Aneen, it's good to see your relatives. Michael Johnson, I'm a Director of Advancement with the NDN Collective. I'm a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes, North Dakota, as Jasmine had mentioned, and just really honored to be here with y'all today in my official capacity with NDN. I spend a lot of time organizing donors and helping facilitate the exact kind of relationships that we're talking about here in this panel. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And Sakita and Roger, just thank you guys for all your awesome words of wisdom so far. And yeah, I just fully agree that, when I first started doing development work 10 years ago, there was this, these very transactional strategies about how we engaged with different donors, right? We would look for a LOI opportunity, we would submit a general form, and it was a lot harder to build relationships with people. And I think it was a symptom of the work that was mirroring kind of a capitalistic organizational structure in the nonprofit sector, right? And I think one of the things we've realized is that we can't build our sector's structure after one of the main problems that we're looking to change in our community, right? Capitalism is one of the main drivers of inequity, and one of the reasons that you see, we can call them disadvantaged, or we can call them planned out of communities, because I think it's more actual the truth there. But recognizing that if we really want to get to a place of equity and justice, it is going to take a different design of programming, right? And so we've been really fortunate at the NDN Collective to be able to impress upon our partners and our donor friends that it's not just the resources that are important to move into our communities, although we have a huge need for resources. It's also about how decision-making power over those resources moves into our community. Part of our theory of change really rests upon the idea that the people closest to the pain and closest to the problem have the most pragmatic solutions to increase health or benefit in their own lives and for their communities. And so our model really is about what does it look like when you radically redesign the funding model to provide resources to the grassroots, to the leaders in community that are embedded doing the work, right? And our theory of change obviously says, like, kind of nobody's free until we're all free, right? And so this actually opens up the aperture of what it means to be in like relation and in kind of trust-based philanthropic relationships with people. And it gives us the opportunity to move past like singular focuses, but to talk about inequities and justice at a national meta level, right? And some of the work that we're doing in that frame, I would point to the relationship builds that we're doing with Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, and how are we normalizing the equity movements between Indigenous communities and Black communities, because literally we're fighting for the same kind of recognition and status access in mainstream society. So I would also just kind of point to a couple seminal documents that I think are helpful in this context, because they really add some value and ethics to the conversation. We're adherents of the Policy Link Equity Manifesto, which really challenges how we center disadvantaged or unheard voices, and how those of us who have access create the space and do more of kind of servant leadership and taking that on as a challenge. And then, you know, it fits for us because of the community organizing that we do, but I would also offer the HEMES organizing principles as a framework of equity, of how we get in right relationship with community, honor their wishes, not prescribe kind of top-down solutions, but recognize the uniqueness and variety and the spectrum of solutions that can happen at the grassroots level that actually hold more legitimacy for success in community. And I'll stop there. Check.
Thank you very much, Michael. I've heard some great things in response to the question of connecting deeply with frontline communities. I love the idea of a reparations framework. Trust-based philanthropy is a phrase that we continue to hear pop up, and would love to see more organizations adapting that. Understanding how we got here, of course, and going beyond transaction to transformation. It looks as though we're even starting a reading list. Equity Manifesto is a fantastic read for anyone who has not read it yet. And using a document that helps folks around understand organizing principles is all very useful. Thank you to all three of you. So we'll move into the next question, and we'll have Roger start and then follow up with others. How can funders redesign or undesign traditional approaches to grant making that will allow them to better understand the connections between racial equity and climate solutions?
Thanks, Jasmine, for the question. You know, I remember back when I was a executive director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network in California and engaged in this heated debate with a solar policy advocate in the state. This is probably 10, 15 years ago. And I'm arguing for why there needs to be more solar for low income folks, and how folks of color have been excluded from the job growth and job opportunities. And his response to me was, well, I do solar policy, I don't do social policy. And I think that's indicative of not only the climate field, but certainly of climate funders as well. We've largely focused on climate as sort of this big policy question. How do we get the biggest reductions for the least costs? And what that has done, it's left people out of the equation. It's left inequity out of the equation. It's left the conversation around power, like people power, the political power, out of the equation as well. How are we going to build a base that's big enough to get the kind of big, bold solutions that we need? And I find that climate funders in particular are really struggling because they believe that they have to make this choice between making progress on climate change or addressing racial justice. And it's really this false either or formulation it's the heart of their struggle. I feel like addressing racial justice would only delay progress on climate change, or driving the big reductions out of the system would not come if they addressed racial justice in the similar way that solar advocate was sort of talking to me. They didn't want to get into the complicated field of racial justice and social policy, when in fact energy policy and climate policy is very much social policy. It's only that we choose to ignore the impacts on people. I think others are really beginning to understand that when we incorporate racial justice as central to addressing climate change, that we get bigger, bolder, faster solutions. And as Michael said, this is an approach that really supports tangible, equitable solutions that actually improves people's lives. They can see it, they can touch it, they can smell it, and they're a part of it. And that really helps build power. As an example, our grantees in New Mexico, which is the state is the third largest oil producing state in the country, just passed a bill this session to guide the economy to diversify away from oil and gas. It makes up about 40% of the state budget. And unless you tackle that economic problem, you're never going to move oil and gas out of the state of New Mexico. They also, as a part of that bill, passed some provisions to provide for job training in rapidly growing renewable energy economy, especially in indigenous communities and in rural communities where it's mostly Latinx communities that are in need of those jobs. So they were able to build this incredible political power with organizations that were Latinx-led, indigenous-led, groups that have been not funded by climate philanthropy traditionally. And I think just to close, climate philanthropy needs to understand that the climate imperative is a racial justice imperative, and that the groups may not look like, talk like, or act like traditional climate organizations. That's actually probably a good thing. We need to actually shift our center of resources, or center of gravity and center of resources to organizations that frankly look different than what we've been funding in the past.
Thanks, Roger. Michael, how about you?
Thanks, Jasmine. And, as Roger said, I think that there's a huge opportunity to think through some of the kind of the policy or kind of big frameworks that are out there in the conversation right now. I think when we think about like a just transition framework around the environmental investments that we're making, what it means to center communities that have been, bypassed economically in the traditional energy sectors, right? When you think about the coal that was being mined down at the Navajo Nation over the past, 50, 70 years, and the current closure of those coal mines, what people don't recognize is that those coal mines were the battery of the Southwest. I mean, Vegas, Southern California, we're all drawing energy out of those coal mine energy production fields that were happening down at Navajo. As those plants close down, there's an opportunity to release that infrastructure and think about, through a just transition framework, how we're centering community benefits for the people where the energy is actually being produced. I mean, I don't know if it would surprise you guys, but just to say the statistics, like, while you literally have the battery of the Southwest at the Navajo Nation in these coal plants, you have over 50,000 homes at Navajo that do not have access to electricity. So you're literally talking about traditional people living in their traditional agrarian lifestyle with high tension power lines running over their house that they don't have access to. They're dealing with the pollution of the Oh shit.
Oh. We got you.
Oh.
We caught the last part. We caught the last part.
really saw myself freeze off there. Sorry about that, guys. But yeah, thinking about a just transition framework can be really beneficial in this context. I also think, kind of to Roger's other point, thinking about integrated capital approaches. And in this way, I'm not talking about like how we're building a financial stack of money for a project or for a community, but how are we thinking more holistically about deploying philanthropic dollars, people power, i.e. like technical assistance and capacity building bundled with those dollars. And then when it's appropriate, how are we creating access to like impact investing money that can help a community take hold of renewable energy products that will not only benefit the environment, but enhance socioeconomic conditions for the community. And finally, I would wrap all of this up and say that there's a huge opportunity for philanthropy to be thinking through these lenses as we look to how we will help the Biden administration go forward in the 30 by 30 initiative. So where does philanthropy dollars help unlock new renewable energy projects happening in urban or rural disadvantaged communities? And how are we creating ownership structures that can lead to generational prosperity in these places? To me, that is the hallmark of true equity. Check.
Thank you, Michael. Sakita, any follow-up you have? And then we have a question that I think we'll have time for in this segment.
Yeah, this has been great. I'm so glad this is being recorded. I'm going to go back and review this. I think great comments from Michael and Roger. One thing, and my background is working with the California Energy Commission, working with the state government on these issues, and kind of being in that world of climate policy. And one thing that comes to mind on this is that we can't get stuck in a carbon, I call it a carbon silo or a GHG silo. In my view, after doing that work, it's a myth. This is not about carbon. This is about getting in right relationship with each other, and getting in right relationship with our Mother Earth, so that we can sustain human life in harmony with the environment. It requires rejecting, in my view, rejecting the principles, and I think this is, Michael and Roger, I think you kind of mentioned this, rejecting the principles that got us here in the first place. So being very aware of when we are acting and funding and moving in ways that is, and Michael, I think you talked about capitalism and using principles of white supremacy and colonial behavior, colonialism, like all of these things are in us because we're all kind of been interacting with it for generations. And so being very aware of that, I think, and doing our best, and it's a process to reject a lot of those principles of truth that have really let us down, or I'm putting truth in quotation marks, but let us down this very harmful path. And instead of the carbon silos, and again, this was already kind of talked about, we need to be more intersectional. And I think folks are hearing this more and talking about it more. And I just want to put an exclamation point, and I think it's very powerful, because what it does is it helps us to root in solutions that consider all or many factors. It's like being just self-aware, you know, where you're considerate. You don't just think about, you know, the issues of water. You don't just think about education. You don't just think about, you know, air pollution. You're in a space, and this is the power of frontline community work, because frontline communities don't have the privilege to just think about one thing in a silo. There's a necessity to think about everything, to be intersectional. And so I think it's important. This is why tying it back to, and I think Roger, you were talking about this, and maybe Michael as well, but the importance of aligning with and supporting frontline communities. And so, yeah, I think, you know, with that, one issue, and some folks might already do some integrated voter engagement, but it requires, climate change has required sacrifice zones, has required racial hierarchy. If we didn't have racial hierarchy, we wouldn't have climate change, because climate change has required these concentrated areas and kind of unchecked industries to do what Michael was just talking about to Navajo Nation. And so when people have power, so invest in people power. When people have power, whether it's through voting and other ways, that helps us to create balance and actually check this capitalistic, you know, very industry favoring society that we are now in. And so thinking of things intersectionally, it becomes very powerful, and it really allows us to get to the root of the issues and to carry forward the solutions that we need, that aren't false solutions, but actually can be lasting solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Akita. And we have a question related to powers. I'm glad you all have brought that up. What do you do about the large parts of philanthropy that are unwilling to talk about power or are actively benefiting from non-just power dynamics? And this is for anyone who wants to answer.
That is philanthropy specifically, or any industries? Sorry, I missed the first.
Well, the question is to philanthropy. This is for any of you all to answer.
I mean, we take that on as part of our organizing program. I'll be totally honest. We do so much advocacy on behalf of our people and kind of thinking about what equity and justice really looks like. And I would say to those that are not paying attention to how resources and power can affect community, like they will be soon, because I think that's the whole move of the philanthropic industry right now. And I think that there are those of us, that have been part of this industry for long enough and representing our communities in a certain kind of way to advocate for, inclusion, if you will. And I think we're kind of starting to take a different approach to it, where I'm not necessarily asking to come sit at the table of established New York highbrow ivory tower philanthropy, but I'm asking them, who's actually the social engineer here? Is it you because you have a lot of money, or is it me and my community because we're oriented to the problems and to the pain that we face? And so I think to the best way that we can, I think these conversations, these dialogues and these meditations with the industry, with the industrial complex of philanthropy, are the way that we start moving these conversations forward and really start thinking about, does it have to be an us versus them mentality? Are we both on the same side of this argument trying to force good change in community? Because I think it changes the formula and the dynamic.
The starting place for the equity fund really is the idea that climate change is a political problem, and it's a political power problem first and foremost. With that, so civic engagement funding is core to it. We also have a C4, which obviously does more funding on the political side of the equation as well. Our opposition understands this in a way that, frankly, climate philanthropy does not. You look at the political power that they've built. You look at who they go after. I mean, they target communities of color specifically because climate philanthropy hasn't funded in communities of color. So they're able to drive the wedge, use disinformation, talk, sort of set this notion of, climate as being a white crunchy granola hippie thing, as opposed to being something that is central to the lived experience of folks of color in this country, which has been largely negative. But also there's great opportunity if we do this right in terms of the kinds of outcomes that we can have in improving health, improving economic conditions, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. You also look at how the opposition has gone after our sources of power in particular, and the attacks on voting rights in places like Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, you name the state, Texas. They totally understand that the source of power for us on the issue of climate and other progressive issues is our folks of color. And until climate philanthropy understands that and begins to seriously invest in building power in communities of color, then we're going to be outspent by the opposition exponentially and continue to be outspent. So I think we really have to understand the centrality of power if we're going to really mount the kind of effort we need to win.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks to all of you. Oh, sorry, Sakita, did you want to get in that comment real quick?
Okay, really quick if there's time. I think it depends on the particular organization and literally the individuals and the culture. So it requires some deep learning there. But I think peer-to-peer work, actually helps. So similarly situated organizations that have made that transition, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Having research and numbers and things like that really help, I think, a lot. I've seen some pretty some individuals transform literally from their kids, a lot of this happens from within, right? What's going to hit people, whether it's watching George Floyd get lynched or, your daughter coming to you and saying, this is an important issue. I think it's been very interesting to see how that transition happens and, having some healthy, calling in and calling out when folks are not, are still funding in the same ways that are actually really harmful. Thank you.
Thanks. So the next question is for Michael, and if we have time, we'll ask one of you to also respond, but this reflects back to one of the earlier opening comments about engaging community. And so how do you explain to foundation staff the importance of deeper grants directly into communities instead of the broader approaches that sometimes miss those communities most impacted?
Thanks, Jasmine. The first thing I would say is that at NDN, we're trying really hard not to build transactional relationships. This actually isn't about the money in the beginning of the conversation, right? So we're trying to make sure that we have good ethical alignment, that people are understanding our body of work and our body politic, because they are kind of synonymous for our organization. Hashtag land back, y'all. So for us, there's no hurry to be in right relationship with our funders, right? And for us, it's really important that we're understood and that you can really take the totality of our holistic approach as a body of work, right? Because it's important to understand, kind of to Sakita's point, the multiple levers that have to get pulled to create an empowerment movement within a community, right? It's economics, it's health, it's education, it's leadership design, it's workforce development, right? It's access to lands. For us, it's culture, tradition, and language revitalization, and it's other things along those lines. So part of the conversation that I think philanthropy is waking up to is that the whole idea of scale is necessarily shallow and broad, right? You're looking for a one-size-fits-all solution when you're talking about scale. I'm here to argue that Indigenous people are not monolith. We have great regional diversity, and even within our regions, we have great tribal nation diversity amongst our people. And so when we're thinking about scale for us, I like to invert the whole idea of it, and I like to talk about vertical scale. And I know it's kind of an abuse of the language, but stick with me. When we talk about vertical scale, what I'm talking about is what does it look like when we concentrate resources and focus in a community and go deep in investment into the people, places, and things that make up the issues that we're trying to face, right? So what does it mean when we're funding the grassroots organizing community that's doing the civic engagement in the community, while we're also investing in community renewable energy solutions, whether they're off-grid or at the utility scale level, right? bringing these different solutions into community creates this like yes and or both and approach to the work that actually is building on like the actual fabric of reality, which isn't siloed, right? Nobody lives in like just their education equity bucket for their whole lives. They're also dealing with food deserts and racist police and, you know, state-sanctioned violence on their people. So I think it's a lot about kind of turning this notion of broad and shallow scale on its head and thinking about more about what it means to go deep in community to affect the change that we're actually looking for. And then, I mean, the other part of it for me is that it gets back to kind of this trust-based philanthropy idea in that, you know, 10 years ago, I was up at the Ford Foundation with IFIP, Indigenous Fund or International Funders of Indigenous People. And they were presenting to us what the big American foundations were investing into in Indigenous communities. They showed us the top 5 things. I can promise you those were not the top 5 important things for my community. I promise you they weren't. I know they weren't. And when I brought this up to them, they had never thought about actually asking my community what were the most important things to be invested in. These were the schemas and ideas coming out of coastal ivory tower philanthropy that they thought we should be a part of, right? We didn't move the needle in any of those spaces because the design was top down rather than bottom up. And I think it's really getting into the right relationship in community and taking the cues of what needs to be intervened and fixed based on the community's agenda, not necessarily a funder's agenda. Check.
Thanks, Michael. I love that vertical scale versus horizontal scale. Sakita, you have about 2 minutes if you want to respond.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. And I, you know, sitting with this, I think many of us maybe have had this experience, but I think it's important to really connect with and like fall in love with the transformation that frontline BIPOC communities are already creating, what they're fighting for, and also already actively creating. Really connecting with it, I think, allows you to, I don't know if it's be convinced is the right word, but to really advocate for as much as possible within your organizations how to move money and how to proceed. But just mentioning some group, and Roger and Michael are working with groups who are doing phenomenal work, and some of the groups that there's a lot of overlap as well. But just calling out in New York, Uprose, that's fighting for a public-private partnership to build wind farm in the Bronx. Memphis Communities against the pipeline, that's just had a huge pipeline win against the Byhalia pipeline. Phenomenal. I mean, these are community folks, largely volunteer. And what happens if we actually fund adequately these initiatives? Honor the Earth is another partner that we've worked with that are simultaneously fighting, yet another pipeline line 3, and also at the same time, envisioning and following up on this just transition with a hemp economy and other things happening. Like, it's just, for me, I remain inspired and so excited to do the work to make sure that money moves to support the amazing work that's already happening. And I think once you have that connection and understanding the power of what's moving, then it really helps to I think follow through with what Michael was saying, that deeper and more effective type of philanthropy.
Thanks, Sakita, and we'll stick with you for the next question. But you also mentioned data in one of your earlier comments. And in our last webinar, we looked at research that documented a $2.8 million gap between funding for BIPOC and white-led organizations. What, in your mind, is one thing that every foundation could do right now to close this gap? And then we'll have Roger and Michael also respond.
I think the first thing that came to mind is to really do some deep, like, anti-racism training and like decolonization work, because I think this is appalling. Like, for me, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up at all. And so there has to be some internal process. And many of us have already done it, and we're just kind of working institutions that are still not there. And so maybe we just got to keep taking the time. The other thing quickly is to set goals. Just, have set goals that are very public and that really force an institutional redirection of how we fund. Those are some things that came to my mind.
Roger, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just do it, right? Start moving the money, make the commitment, as Sakita said, set those goals, and prepare yourself for an agenda to learn along the way, right? So that you're not going to have it all figured out at the very beginning, but I think taking the step is the first and most important thing to do. But and it takes time to do all the things that we've talked about, sort of developing the partnerships, developing the understanding. So that sort of deep understanding that you need with the grantees and what they're up against as well. So set yourself an agenda to learn along the way as you're doing it, but don't delay in doing it. But I think first and foremost, again, it's like understanding that this is necessary. Like that gap is exactly the reason why we're losing so badly, right? And again, like our opposition understands that gap and that it exists. And until we make right that gap and fill it, we're not going to be in a place where we're going to be getting the kind of change that we need.
So Roger's taking the Nike approach, just do it. Michael, how about you?
Well, the first thing I would actually do is challenge that number. In some of the research that we've done in Indian country, we found that people that are coding their gifts to indigenous service, interventions are actually going to white-led institutions that are doing work in our communities. There's a whole nother problem to unpack there, right? So I would actually question the data set first and foremost. And I would say that one of the great funding opportunities for philanthropy right now is to get into data sovereignty, right? Where are you funding your partners to own their own data? Why are we relying on GuideStar and Candid to report this stuff back to us? We're the architects doing the interventions and the work. We should be able to talk about this side of it too, and not rely on, kind of third-party watchdogs to refeed us our own coded information. So that's kind of my first challenge is I question the data. I think it's actually a lot worse than that. And I would challenge us to actually get to the bottom of that in a good way that leaves community and community practitioners in control of the data that's meaningful to the work that they're doing. Secondly, I think it is right. It's about getting in relationship and dispelling these things around perfection, right? I'm not looking for a funder to come into my community with a perfect and like 100% thought out rollout of a new program for Indian country. I want them to show up. I want them to listen. I want them to get in community with us, and then we'll figure out where the funding opportunities come. Let's not put the cart before the horse. That's, again, I think that urge to be transactional, right? In the same breath, I'm also recommending that you don't extract from the partners that you currently have, right? You want to get oriented to working in Indian country, compensate the partners that you have for their expertise and orientation to the field, right? And so I think that there's a lot of organizations you can look to. I'm a little biased on the Indigenous side of this conversation, so I would uplift my board member and friend, Edgar Villanueva, and his Decolonizing Wealth project is a great place to start some of this conversation. In addition, Native Americans in Philanthropy is traditionally one of the houses that we use to help politicize and educate the nonprofit field. And so I would urge you to reach out to my friend Eric Stegman over there, who can help orient and help build out different kinds of programs and schemas if you're interested in really kind of walking the walk or just do it around equity investments in communities of color.
And just to add, NDN Solutions Project, there's a whole list of intermediaries that can help funders enter in to learn, to kind of walk alongside on this journey. And you should be utilizing these intermediaries and their skills and their capacities to do that as well and do it right.
Thanks to all of you, and I want to pick up on this data piece, particularly Michael, your response on data sovereignty, which I think is fantastic. We all know in philanthropy, and including climate philanthropy, has a long history of relying on data to make strategic funding decisions, and can sometimes use the lack of existing data to justify not funding a certain community or issue. And I'll start with you, Roger, to pick up where we left off. Why is it important for climate philanthropy to change its perspective on data to more effectively support BIPOC communities? And what can our participants, those who are on today, do to change this perspective?
Well, I think the way that data has been used historically has often been very, very problematic. It's been used to reify existing power structures, to keep people out, to kind of define issues in ways that are not reflective of how regular folks may understand the issue, or certainly using data as a power move, right, to determine who has power and who doesn't have power over a particular issue. So I think it's really important that we really interrogate sort of where data comes from, the use of data, and how good that data set even is. As Michael even pointed out on the the funding gap data is not truly reflective of the actual gap that exists out there. The environmental justice movement has been dealing with this for decades, right? In terms of like what kind of data should we be placing importance on in terms of understanding an issue. We have many thousands of noses next to a refinery that tell you that there's a lot of bad stuff coming out of it, and an air district or a regulator will put one air monitor across a fence on the other side of the refinery and say, like, that's the only thing that matters is the data that's going to be gathered by this one little piece of equipment. So I think existing data certainly has been used against communities of color and communities that have lacked power before in this way as well. So I think what philanthropy needs to do is to, again, sort of understand the ways in which regular folks of color understand these issues, and acknowledge that this data, the data of lived experience, and then particularly in Indigenous communities, the data of historic knowledge, generations worth of knowledge of our natural systems, is just as valid or just as important, or maybe even more important than the other data that exists out there. So I think really interrogating the sources of data, what kind of data is being used to make decisions is critically important.
Sakita, how about you?
I think that's exactly right. I think, the points that Roger were making makes, a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot of deep transformation that can happen from following that. I'm just kind of double tapping on listening. This is coming up a lot. Listen to when, frontline, forefront leaders, grantee partners are saying they have data. I mean, it might not look like, the peer-reviewed kind of data that we would want to see or presented in the colors and the whatever that we would want, but it's there, it's knowledge, it's knowledge that's there. And to be able to listen to that, and also listen to when folks are saying that there's a need for more research. I think there's a lot of communities where there's enough research there and we can move forward. And there's spaces where, folks are calling for, we don't really understand what's happening. We know something's wrong, but we want to understand more deeply. Or we have this solution, we want to move in this direction with this new water system or something like that. We just need a little bit of support with research on it, and start to support, through philanthropy, support community-driven, community-designed research projects that really, and as Michael had pointed out before, that the data itself is owned, sovereign data, it's owned by the communities who can steward that information. And I think, I'll end with that, but I think those are, really helpful to kind of adjust the relationship that we have and what we think of as research and data, and doing it in a way that, shifts power and actually just overall increases the quality and quantity of information that we carry forward as we're thinking through solutions to the problems that we're addressing.
Thanks, Sakita. And Michael, you started on this a little bit with your response to the last question, but I want to see if you have anything else you want to add for this piece.
Just a couple points. I wanted to reiterate something that Roger was talking about there, about the superiority of like written Euro quantified science in this regard, right? I seriously have a problem with that. I do uphold my traditional ecological knowledge of my people who have been in these lands for millennium as it's another part of the data question, and something that is just as soluble. It holds just as much water as the Western scientific techniques. And so I think how, again, we're kind of opening the aperture to think about how are we thinking about oral traditions or histories or the collective consciousness, to pull Zhang into the conversation a little bit, around a community's understanding of the perils and the problems that they're facing, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be millennia old information about a geography, but what a community is currently facing in light of a new pipeline coming in, or oil spills, or different kinds of things, right? There's also modern access to this that isn't like in the quantifiable field necessarily. The other thing I would say along this point, I'd like to bring up, invoke Vine Deloria Jr., one of our best Indigenous scholars and minds of the last century. In his book, God is Red, he does a really interesting meditation about why oral traditions are actually probably more true than the written word. And I mean, the shortcut answer is like everybody in a community, you can't lie about what the story is because everybody experienced it. So there's a truth there when it's a shared story of community. And that's different than maybe King James writing a Bible, for example.
I love that.
So yeah, I'll stop on that point. I keep going. That is kind of
Okay. No, but I love that piece on the oral tradition particularly. So, so this is my last question before we move into Q&A. And so I invite each of you to respond, and we'll start with Sakita. How can funders educate themselves on the issue of the historic and current racism in climate philanthropy and grassroots change activism in a way that leads them to prioritize supporting community groups, activists, and movement builders?
Great question. And I love all Michael, citing actual publications and things to read. Those sound like a great place to start. I think we've talked about quite a bit the listening to frontline leaders, to BIPOC communities, to our grantee partners. And just, I think, and this is a process that I've gone through as well, is just being uncomfortable. I think we have been living with a lot of assumptions. And so this process of education is one that will create discomfort at times. So not to shy away from that, but to maybe even lean into it. And on the other side of it will be, it will be very liberating. And so to stick with that process. I think, I think I'll stop there.
Roger, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, getting to the why this is important and necessary is critical. So I don't think many funders understand, or I don't think many funders see community groups, activists, movement builders as necessary, right, for the change that they're trying to support or the goals that they may have in their program or in their foundations. I think if funders actually really interrogated, more how power is created, how it's wielded, how change is made, then you get to the understanding of the central importance of community organizing, of movement building, of grassroots engagement, of racial justice as critical to the implementation of their goals. And I find that, when funders don't do this, but are, really trying to fund Black and brown folks because they don't have enough Black and brown folks in their portfolio, then it's more of a box checking exercise rather than really fundamentally engaging into the reasons why and seeing this as a core piece of their strategy to accomplish the goals of their work. So partly I would, really turn the question back on funders as to also like, why don't you see this as necessary? Why do you think we can, why do you think you can accomplish the goals that you have without also engaging in supporting community organizing, supporting community groups, supporting building power, given all that we're up against?
Michael, take us home.
Oh, it's such an interesting question because I think there's such a spectrum of solution here for people that I think there's a lot of variety in how you answer this or address this in a better way. I think it does have everything to do with getting an in-right relationship with the communities that you're interested in supporting and listening, really leaning into that trust-based philanthropy, really thinking about what participatory frameworks look like as you're designing these things in partnership with your partners. The other thing about it that I think we need to call out and kind of challenge though is like, this isn't an us versus them attitude, right? This isn't like the allocators of endowments, working against the people in the field. We're all actually on the same side of this thing, and we actually have to normalize the conversation about how resources and power is moving. It's a really tense, it's a tough conversation, but we need to get right with it, right? I'm really interested in this part of it because once we get rid of the performative side of what our relationship builds are in the nonprofit sector, right? There's a certain expectation of me that I'm performative to the things I wrote in the grant application, right? But there's a better relationship to be had about the honesty and the inner workings of what's actually happening on the ground. And the better my relationship with a funding partner is, A, the better they understand the intricacies of the things that we're doing. But we've also cultivated a brave space. I don't believe in safe places in this field, y'all. I believe in brave spaces. I believe that we can cultivate spaces to say our truths and own our truths. And we'll see where the cards land when we do those, when we manifest that kind of a relationship with our funding partners. But I also think that it takes a certain kind of understanding by the funding community to recognize this is not an us versus them. The resources that you guys are protecting in the endowments were ill-gotten. They were built on land theft, genocide, and slavery. Like, just get right with that. You got to start with Howard Zinn, start with Howard Zinn. If you got to start with like, something a little more kitschy, then start there. If you need to start with like School of Rock, start there. But I'm saying there's a lot of different ways to get at this information, and it's not to be extractive on, it's not on my community. My community should not be burdened in answering this question. Figure this part out for yourself, y'all. And then, the other thing I would say is that we all find ourselves in the same system in this country, right? Our perspectives are different, right? I have a perspective as an Indigenous man that differs from Jasmine's experience as a Black woman. But the fact is that we're still within the same social context and system. And until I'm free of the things that blockade me, Jasmine can't be free. Until Jasmine's free of the things that blockade her, I can't be free. So it's also recognizing that in some ways we're all in the same system working towards different ends, or towards the same ends, but from different perspectives within that system. And I think there's a unifying message there. It kind of gets out of the industry talk and really allows us to be people working towards solving solutions or solving problems that we were kind of the architects of in society.
All right, thank you to everyone. We're going to move into questions from the audience. And if you don't mind, folks who are off camera, if you're able to turn on your cameras, please feel free to do so, and we want to turn this into a conversation. And if you want to put a question in the chat, you're welcome to do that. If you want to raise your hand, I have all the boxes open now so I can see everybody, so I can look out for you. But let's go ahead and get started with anyone who has a question they want to pose to our speakers related to what you've heard today. And we have about 15 minutes for questions, so plenty of time. Joel, let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Joel Espino with the One Collective. Just want to say deeply appreciate y'all taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us. I know a lot of you and Michael, I don't think we've had a chance to meet, and just really appreciate what you're bringing for us here to consider. So I have this question. I'm new to philanthropy. I've been at the One Collective just over a year. And in this year, I've been thinking a lot about our movement infrastructure, right? That's the hot topic in progressive philanthropy these days. And so if I'm analyzing that idea of movement infrastructure, I see you all, equity intermediaries, as an essential part of what the modern, climate movement should look like that is more just and equitable. So we've talked a lot about, what climate philanthropy could do for communities, how they should reorient, how they should interrogate themselves. But what do you all need? What do you all need as intermediaries that are led by folks of color that are embodying this new way of doing things? What do you all need to have higher impact, to be more successful? Just wanted to see if there's anything there that you can share with us.
I'll jump in here real quick. It looks like Sakita's got something on follow. Joel, it's great to meet you, man. Just like in full transparency, the Win Collective is not only a thought partner of ours through their program officer, Jody Archambault, but one of our main funding partners at NDN Collective. And I think one of the great things about our relationship with WIND is that they recognize the need to create agency along with the funding that goes into community, right? So not only do they resource us, but they allow us to dictate how we prioritize the use of those resources. And that has become paramount to how we're able to show up for community and kind of create this ubiquitous access to like indigenous power through our programming, right? And so it's like, it's really been paramount. And I think it really gets at the crux of the thing that I'm interested in mostly talking about in this, is that decision-making power has to move with the resources into community. You got to trust the people that you're partnering with, that they know how to do the right thing. When we talk about overly restricted programmatic partnerships, what the inference is for me as a practitioner is you don't actually trust what I think I know how to do in my community. You're saying this is what I'm comfortable with. This is what fits into my kind of Western schema of evaluation about the programming that we're doing, right? And so I'm like, how do we make sure that agency, decision-making power are like the other parts of the funding and resource tripod for community, right? How are communities then in charge of the resources that are going to ultimately affect their community? And so I think it just has to do with getting in good relationship and moving trust and decision-making power with the money.
Yes, great question, great response. I think the trust is important. You know, patience, or just kind of reevaluating how we think of time and how we think of like success, but allowing that success to be defined by really not, because we don't define it at the Solutions Project. And, you know, our grantee partners are the ones who defined what's successful, what's success or not. And so I think trusting in that process and kind of shifting that, you know, who's designing, who's making the rules around what's working or what's not, to the folks who are working on the ground. I think having funders who have themselves are actively doing this decolonizing work that we've been talking about, this anti-racism work, is really helpful, because then we don't have to explain so much why we work in the way that we do, but we're kind of coming together on the same page in that way. And for me, it's like the conversations are just way more fruitful and I think powerful in that way. And the last thing I'll say is, Michael, you're talking about the performative nature of this work is sticking with me so much. I'm going to sit with that. But really being authentically, I think, aligned, and this is just deep empathy, I think, but with both the struggles and successes of this work. And I kind of say that, you know, your question's interesting, because I'm saying it like for us, but really we are responding to our grantee partners. So it's still, again, about how we're, you know, philanthropy is in right relationship with our grantee partners. We're just kind of a conduit to help that happen, because we hold deep trust in relationships with communities. But really it's that connection that we've been talking about, I think, the whole time, but really actually being, you know, feeling deep joy in the success of our grantee partners and really believing in that work. And I think, again, that becomes a way more joyful and liberated space for philanthropy to be in once that connection is made. And one other thing I'll say is, in terms, and again, this is for our grantee partners, but also I guess for us, but like funding capacity. So, you know, we're dealing with, you know, reversing or repairing hundreds of years of, you know, really, really deep oppression and stealing of land and genocide and slavery, as Michael, you brought forward into this, right? So this is not, oh, let's just add another zero at the end of our grant, or a couple of zeros, and we're good. Add all the zeros on, yes. And this transfer of wealth that we're hoping can happen needs to happen in a way that's really, and we've all been talking about this, that happens with deep, I think, connection to, listening, right relationship, trust. That leads you not to just writing checks. That leads you to knowing your grantee partners very deeply, understanding that there's, you know, some staffing needs that might happen, that might be needed. There's some accounting support. There's a need to have patient capital. Maybe a grantee partner wants all the money at one time. Maybe they want it spread out more. It's a bigger, and I think more rewarding and definitely more effective way of approaching it. But that capacity, support, and valuing that I think could be really helpful as well.
I'll just add that this is really challenging for climate funders in particular in the climate field. I mean, because hearing probably all the things that Michael and Sakita have said, folks are feeling like, oh, but the climate thing is so urgent. We need to drive as many tons out of the system as we can. And if we do this stuff, it's going to take too long. We can't build capacity. That's a long slog. And there's no way my board is going to, not let us focus on like this sector and getting this many tons out of transportation, because that's the strategy. So there's sort of this prevailing notion about how we've, understand and define the problem and what the solutions are. And it really is, I forget the term that Sakita used, but I call it the sort of a very carbon fundamentalist approach that is really just focused on molecules and not about the people and the power and the political systems that you need to actually get those things done. So, when we go into a state, we don't say hey, everybody, we're going to work on an RPS together and that's the thing because we're focused on the power sector. We start with just talking to organizations about how are you thinking about climate change and energy, and how are you going to build power around this issue? And what you find is that, folks are there. They understand the urgency more than we understand the urgency, frankly, right? Because they're living it every day. I mean, they've got family members that have died because of this. So, so I think like our field uses urgency as a weapon against these communities, as if climate change is not something that's already urgent to these communities already. But so we don't go in and say this is what you're going to work on. We go in and say like, how are you thinking about working on this? Like, how does it already show up in your community, and how are you going to build power to do that? And that's there's various on-ramps to the issues as a result of that. And sometimes it leads to the power sector, sometimes it leads to transportation, sometimes it leads to to oil and gas expansion, but ultimately it leads to climate change. And that's the beauty of it, is that groups really understand how to work together in this space too. Even though my thing may be this refinery and your thing is about fracking, but I know that I can't win on my own. So we're going to have to figure out a partnership or a coalition together to build enough power to do this work. And just finally, like, the capacity building is absolutely essential and important. But I think we all find in our work that the investments that we make, the grants that we make, have immediate impact. Folks are winning stuff, and they have been winning stuff over and over again with really minimal resources. If we could actually fund them at the scale that they need, they'd be winning a whole lot more. But the capacity building is, yes, a long-term need, but let's not forget that even with the resources that they have right now, they're able to get things done that we couldn't have imagined that they could have gotten done. So it's not an either or.
Thanks, everyone. Any other questions for our speakers? Thanks, Hillel, for your question. Grace, you have a question.
Thank you, everyone. This has been an amazing conversation to listen to. I sort of piggybacking on what Roger has said, I work actually at the intersection of environment and increasingly climate. And one of the things that I have been struggling with is, how do you pick your partners? How do you distinguish who are the quote unquote good ones versus those who are putting on the face of one? Because, like, quite frankly, right now it's popular to be for lack of a better word, woke. And I'm kind of curious, in the experience of the speakers, like, how have you made your decisions about who to trust on your end, and how you've navigated those spaces where there might be red flags for you, but not necessarily those you work with. Like Michael, you were saying, like, when you were at the Ford Foundation, the priorities that were basically handed down did not jive with what you personally knew to be actual priorities. Like, I'm just curious how you navigated those instances, and how do you, how do you navigate those circumstances? Thank you.
I mean, in that specific context, I sucked all the air out of the room and I ended that meeting early. Those people were not ready to hear what I had to say about that as an Indigenous man. they were not ready for that. They didn't think I was in the room, or they miscalculated me in the room, not to hold my truths, right? So I think it was I've done it a handful of times over my career, Sam, but the things got to get said sometimes, you know. We have a really high tolerance for risk at our organization, because we think the riskiest thing that we could do right now is not lean into what innovation might look like, even though it might not fit a traditional model that we're comfortable with or have the proofs of seeing, right? So for us, we really pride ourselves on taking what we call kind of like mitigated or informed risk in partnership with community. So this is about us really getting to know what the project is, really getting out of this performative transactional conversation about show me your pro forma, or show me like what your off-grid solar array project's going to look like, right? And really getting into like, so what happens in 5 years about the maintenance of these things? How are we going to train community to take care of this? Where's the next battery up going to come from? How are we thinking about this in a bigger way, right? So really kind of like putting on our partnership hat, doing what we can to encourage, while creating the space for community or the doers to have the agency to answer those questions for themselves in their own context. On the other side of it, I think, you know, starting at the very top end of the funnel, a little bit of a tease. One of the projects we're working on with decolonizing wealth and Native Americans in philanthropy is something, and also there's an organization called the Native Ways Federation out there. The Native Ways Federation was actually created by some of our institutional like legacy organizations like Native Americans in Philanthropy or the College Fund, to be able to say like, these are good Indigenous led organizations, right? It's almost like a charity watch that we're self-policing the field of ourselves. So you know, that's a great place to start when you're looking at Indian country, the Native Ways Federation, Native Americans in Philanthropy. But this also gets into like the data sovereignty stuff I was talking about earlier, because those of us who are in the field doing this work on behalf of our communities, we know the answers to these questions, right? Like if you want to know about who to make an investment into in an Indigenous community in Lummi land, like I can help you answer that question. I can help make those connections for you. But how do we democratize that knowledge for everybody in the field so that we don't accidentally become gatekeepers, right? Because that is like the antithesis of what we're trying to do at NDN. There's no reason for us to insert ourselves into all of those conversations. So how do we create publications or portals so that that information has been democratized across the philanthropic field? It's a lot harder to answer that question than it is to ask it, I think. This is kind of when I find those, I'm like, oh, there's the Rubik's Cube. We got to mess around with that a little bit so we can get to a good place. But I also think it's like reverse engineering, right? If you're interested in addressing like BIPOC energy ownership at a utility level, look for the BIPOC communities that don't have ownership of those things and reverse engineer a relationship to the place that you want to be in doing the work. Check.
Yes to all of that. And I don't know, Grace, like what, you know, the nuances of where, you know, where the question comes from. But I do agree with Michael, like, you know, standing in your truth and kind of always having the same value points and repeating and repeating and repeating. It depends on your situation. You know, none of us, we're up here talking and using all this language and we're able to be in this way, but none of us are in like, I don't know, traditional philanthropy, I guess is the right word. So, and I've been there, and it's a different, you know, it is a different setup to how you can be on the inside. And I think it requires a lot of therapy. But to the extent you can stand in your truth is really important. And then for the trust building piece, or like how to know who to trust, I think, you know, similar to what Michael's saying, you need to kind of like check references, like start with who you trust and kind of work from there. And to check references and do research, and then have an exit strategy. And this is tougher. Like this is a lot tougher for me if I'm engaging with somebody that I might introduce to a grantee partner, because then I'm responsible for that person effing things up and extracting from, or our grantee partner having a bad experience. So that is a tougher kind of conversation, and really requires time and deep trust to actually bring forward. If we're engaging with folks, it's, you know, there's a little bit more willingness to kind of move forward with certain partners that we might not know very well, but having an exit strategy if we are like, oh no, they're not aligned like we thought, their website looked great, but it's different. And so those are some offerings on that.
I think, starting from a place where you want the organization to succeed. So, building from that place in the relationship. So, sort of a lot of things that Michael said earlier, so then you have the conversation about what are the things that are maybe tough for the organization that you can actually help them build out to be successful. I get it. Like, we're in the same sort of circumstance in terms of limited resources for the kind of things that we're doing. So it's a constant negotiation in terms of who you're funding and how much you're funding. And a lot of those decisions are also kind of addressed, I think, through a real portfolio approach. So I think Michael, similarly, we're very quote unquote risk tolerant. We'll be there for many years to help an organization to ramp up and get to a place where we think they can be powerful. But we sort of see them in an ecosystem of other organizations that we're also working with in a particular area. We've got our core grantees. We know what they do. They're on it. We have some folks that are, maybe a little bit smaller. They're just figuring things out. We're sort of testing the waters with them, seeing if they can build their base in the way that they say they can, et cetera. So having that sort of a portfolio approach sort of also is a way to address the issue. And then I think finally, and this is something that philanthropy needs to be better at, is really a division of labor among funders, right? So if I've got a set of core grantees, and we try to do this all the time, is there's no reason why a more established funder shouldn't take them on as their grantee, and we can focus more of our resources on some of the other folks that they may deem as higher risk, et cetera. So having conversations with your colleagues in places about what does the division of labor look like to get us to the place where all these organizations are succeeding and successful, and what can I do with the resources that I have within that context. And that takes work. We ask our grantees to coordinate and partner, but we don't do it very well as funders at all to do that. So sort of figure out the division of labor in partnership with your funders to be able to support the broad set of organizations that we actually need.
Thanks to all three of you. And we have time for maybe one last question, if anyone is sitting on a question that they've been waiting to ask. Final call. So thank you to everyone. I want to particularly extend appreciation to our panelists for all of the wonderful insights. Our prep call was an education for me, and this was a second round of education in hearing additional responses to the questions that were asked and some of the earlier conversations. So later today, all of our participants will receive a link to a brief evaluation for today's session. Please take a few minutes to complete it. We really do value your input, and we use it for planning these types of webinars and future webinars. We look forward to continuing this journey and learning from all of you. As I mentioned earlier at the top, this is the second of a series. The next two webinars will take place in September and November. Stay tuned for the dates as we are confirming speakers and their availability right now. And so we'll send updates soon, posted on InDEEP, and send invitations out. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the InDEEP site within a few days, and I may follow up specifically, Michael, with you for this reading list, because I jotted a few down, but I'm sure for all of our speakers, if there are some books you want to recommend, we will include that when we post the recording. So thanks again to our speakers, and also thanks to all of you for your participation and your great questions and insights, and I very much appreciate everyone's participation today. I hope all of you have a great afternoon and a great rest of your week.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks, and see you later.